I'll start off here.
Unanimous consent for colloquy between myself and the senator from South Carolina.
Without objection.
Just to make sure. So very briefly, let Senator McCain lead off, but we're going to talk about the way forward regarding JASTA. So,
I'd like to join my friend and colleague on this issue that is of transcendent importance. Transcendent importance to America's relationship with our friends and allies, with placing literally Americans and American companies and corporations and governments in great danger, particularly governments. I'd just like to mention in passing, if my colleague will indulge me very quickly, because I have here in front of me, and I will ask that it be included in the record, statements from the President of the United States, the Director of the CIA, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense, all on this issue we're talking about. The leaders of our government, from the President on down, including the heads of our most important defense agencies, have expressed, and I will quote them in just a minute. My friends, Congress passed the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, or JASTA. It was well-intentioned to allow claims against foreign governments that might be complicit in terrorist attacks in the United States. The spirit behind the legislation is noble. Any foreign government behind a terrorist attack on our homeland or our citizens must be held accountable. But it has become clear that the unintended consequences of this legislation are quite grave. As it exists now, JASTA presents a significant risk to the United States and our military and diplomatic personnel serving across the globe. As it currently exists, as my colleague from South Carolina will explain in greater detail, JASTA undermines a fundamental international norm of sovereign immunity that protects governments from being sued in court except in narrow circumstances. If this law is not narrow, and please, my colleagues understand, the Senator from South Carolina aren't for abolishing this law. We are putting into a scope that protects the United States of America. And that is, if we allow our laws to target governments indiscriminately, we will expose our country to grave risks and undermine our ability to pursue justice in a complex world. No country in the world stands to lose more from an erosion of these legal standards than the United States of America. The United States has more bases and more forward deployed personnel protecting peace and security than any other country. JASTA now gives these countries an incentive to bring these brave men and women to court to answer for U.S. counterterrorism policies. If other countries pass similar legislation, it means the United States and American soldiers, diplomats, and intelligence officers serving in some of the world's most dangerous and difficult countries will be forced to justify their actions and defend the policies we have made to defend this country before courts that may not share our standards of due process and fairness. Our allies will wonder if it is wise to join our coalitions to fight terrorism if they too will face legal liability in courts around the world. Thus, we are faced with the twisted irony that the men and women who put themselves in harm's way to bring the 9/11 attackers to justice and to defeat those that still seek to attack the United States are the people placed directly at risk by JASTA. We must be concerned with the diplomatic and economic fallout of this law. Our allies and partners around the world, particularly those who struggle with terrorism at home, now wonder when they might be hauled into courts for terrorist actions. They face potential court-ordered damages and asset seizures. Their citizens and companies doing business in the United States are at risk. It is only reasonable that these countries will consider pulling their assets and resources out of the United States out of fear. In short, JASTA could cause our allies in the fight against terrorism to distance themselves from us at a country we most need their support against those who mean to do us harm. Now I'd like to just provide some quotes, Mr. President, Our nation's top national security officials have issued statements and written to Congress to warn us about the unintended consequences of JASTA. Let's begin with President Obama. I quote from his letter in the White House. He wrote, JASTA would neither, quote, neither protect Americans from terrorist attacks nor improve the effectiveness of our response to such attacks. Doing so would instead threaten to erode sovereign immunity principles that protect the United States, including our U.S. armed forces and other officials overseas. I will admit, Mr. President, that Senator Graham and I have a special relationship with the men and women who are serving. His 22 years as a member of the United States Air Force Reserve, every year going to Iraq or Afghanistan. I obviously have sons who have served. I don't want to see my sons or anybody else's sons in court because they might have violated a sovereign nation the way that we are saying that JASTA affects our country. Enacting law according to the president, as I said, would neither protect Americans from terrorist attacks nor improve the effectiveness of our response to such attacks. Doing so would instead threaten to erode sovereign immunity principles that protect the United States, including our U.S. armed forces and others overseas. The Secretary of Defense wrote, and I quote, U.S. service members stationed here and overseas, and especially those supporting our counterterrorism efforts, would be vulnerable to private individuals' accusations that their activities contributed to acts alleged to violate a foreign state's law. He continued to say, whether guilty or innocent, the mere allegation of their involvement could subject them to a foreign court's jurisdiction and the accompanying litigation and intrusive discovery process that goes along with defending against lawsuits. Our service members might be required to testify about or provide documents on operations that they are obligated under U.S. law not to disclose, exposing them to punishment for contempt by the foreign court, including imprisonment. According to the Secretary of Defense, we could be risking imprisonment for the men and women who are serving in our military overseas. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I think we all respect the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Here's his view. Any legislation that risks reciprocal treatment by foreign governments would increase the vulnerability of U.S. service members to foreign legal action while acting in an official capacity. In those cases, the service member could be held in civil or criminal contempt should he or she have refused to appear or otherwise comply with the foreign court's orders. The Secretary of State, John Kerry, wrote, JASTA could encourage foreign courts to exercise jurisdiction over the United States or U.S. officials. Same thing. The director of the CIA wrote, JASTA will have grave implications for the United States. The most damaging consequence would be for those U.S. government officials who dutifully work overseas on behalf of our country. The principle of sovereign immunity protects U.S. officials every day and is rooted in reciprocity. If we fail to uphold this standard for other countries, we place our own nation officials in danger. No country has more to lose from undermining that principle than the United States, and few institutions would be at greater risk than the CIA, which certainly makes sense. So here we have, from the director of the CIA, to the Vice President of the United States, to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to the President of the United States, to the Secretary of Defense, all want us to narrow the interpretation of this law. What does it require? Whose word more do you want? So all I'm saying that we need to narrow the law. We must make it clear that countries will not be held responsible for rogue actions of their citizens unless we can show that a nation knowingly assists a terrorist group. Sovereign nations should not be dragged into our courts. If we don't fix JASTA, our ability to defend ourselves will be undermined, and the people we ask to go into harm's way on our behalf will be placed in jeopardy. America must pursue justice, but in the long run, JASTA will make it harder, not easier, to bring terrorists to justice and prevent terrorism in the first place. We need to fix this law. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent. All those statements from the President of the United States, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Director of the CIA, all be made, and Secretary of State, all be made part of the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
So I would ask my colleague, let's make it clear here. Are we asking to have this law repealed? Are we asking that people in countries that are responsible for acts of terror, are we trying to let them off the hook? Are we trying to say committing acts of terror can be sponsored by any nation and we won't, and we'll turn the other way? That is basically the argument that is being mounted in sometimes hysterical fashion in what we are trying to do to ensure that a government must knowing, maybe not even done it themselves, but knowingly. And isn't that the key, particularly coming from someone with your background as a officer trained in the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the international rule of law?
Well, thank you, Senator McCain. Your overview was excellent about the perils we face as a nation if we don't modify the law. I've tried to give you just a couple of minutes of how did we get here. So after 9/11, the most horrific attack on our homeland, maybe ever, I guess, since the Civil War, the bottom line was that we responded as a nation in many ways. The 9/11 families have a special place in American history in our hearts. They've been pursuing legal claims against those responsible for the attack. Sovereign immunity is a concept that protects our government and every other government from doing business, because if you don't have sovereign immunity, you really can't function as a government. But there are waivers to that concept. A tort, if somebody in Saudi Arabia is driving a car down the streets of New York and they're working for the embassy and consulate and they hit you, there's actually a process where you can sue. You can sue your own federal government, the Federal Tort Claims Act, if you're injured as a result of being hit by a military vehicle. Even though sovereign immunity applies, we've waived that to allow citizens who've been injured tortiously to bring claims in a very controlled process. So the 9/11 families, for well over a decade now, have been pursuing nation states like Saudi Arabia in court, trying to hold them liable for the act of terrorism of the 19 hijackers. Under our law, a tort does not include acts of international terrorism. So I was very open-minded to say, well, certainly that's a tort. You know, if you're injured or killed because of an act of international terrorism, you've been harmed, and I don't mind holding somebody responsible who caused that harm. But now you're getting into the operation of a nation state. So here's what we're saying. Saudi Arabia, if you believe the Saudi government collaborated with the 19 hijackers and they knew or should have known about the attack and they assisted in the attack, not only should they be held liable in our courts, that's probably an act of war under international law. Unfortunately, the way we have structured this law, that requirement doesn't exist. And let me give you an example of how that could come back to haunt us. We're engaged in a conflict in Syria today. We're providing weapons and training to a lot of groups inside of Syria to destroy ISIL. One of those groups is the YPG Kurds. They're literally the cousins of the PKK, a terrorist organization inside of Turkey. There's friction between the Kurds in Syria and the Turkish government, and it's beginning to bubble up. We're knowingly providing training to Kurdish elements inside of Syria for the express purpose of enlisting them in the fight against ISIL. What I don't want to have happen is that the CIA officer, the Special Forces soldier, anybody in our government who's working in the training, equipping process to be held liable, and our country as a whole to be held liable, if that training and those weapons are used to go into Turkey or some other place where we didn't intend for it to happen, didn't know about it. As this law is written now, it is my fear the very act of helping them do one thing could make you liable for everything they do. So we're trying to narrow the scope, and we're trying to make sure that whatever claim against a foreign government lies for the 9/11 attack, that we don't open the door to lawsuits, imprisonment, criminal complaints, liability by us as a nation state for all the activities that we're doing throughout the world. We're training people in Mosul and Iraq today. We've been training the Iraqi security forces. We've been training tribal militia. And the one thing I don't want to have happen is the people who provide the weapons and the training, that if a Sunni group, for some reason out of our control, goes into a Shiite village and commits a genocide, or the reverse, or we're up in the Shiites and they go on a sectarian binge, I don't want us to be held liable unless you can prove that we knowingly engaged in the act in question, that it wasn't enough just to help the tribal leaders, Sunni tribal leaders, fight al-Qaeda, that if they do something outside of what we intended, the only way we can be liable and people working for us can be liable is if we knew about it and we're involved in it. And that's what's missing. So it may be harder for the lawyers representing the 9/11 families to prove the case, but if we don't make the standard as I described, we're opening ourselves up as a nation and all those throughout the world. Nobody understands the world better than Senator McCain. I promise you, we're providing aid and assistance to groups that are very questionable at best, but that's the world in which we live in. The Mideast is a complete mess. And I don't want my country, our country, and those who serve under our flag to ever be hauled in a foreign court because they were doing the training and the equipping that our nation ordered them to do. And I don't want us as a nation to be responsible for acts that we did not know about or intend to happen. Just simply helping somebody doesn't make you liable for all the things they might do down the road. So if there's evidence that the Saudi government knowingly or should have known about the attacks of 9/11 and aided that attack, you can bring a claim. And if it's any less here for the 9/11 attack, then that lesser standard would be used against us, because countries, as I speak, are adopting their version of JASTA. And the one thing we don't want to do is open up the international legal system, the claims against America based on what we did here at home, and not have thought it through very well. I would just end on this. We all voted for it because we're sympathetic to the cause, and we want to make sure the 9/11 families can proceed in court to hold those accountable for the horrific acts against their family. I don't think we're helping those families by passing a law that's not well thought out and putting other families at risk or in the fight today. This is not suing for a war that's over. The damage is done after the war. The war on terror is very much alive and well. And as far as the eye can see, America is going to be involved in equipping and training and aiding and assistance groups. And I don't want our country to be held liable and the people we ask to do the training and equipping to find themselves in a foreign court unless we as a nation knew and intended the consequence in question. So if we don't change this law, we'll have not served those in the fight very well. And we can modify this law in a way to allow claims to go forward post 9/11. All of us agreed to a process to allow the 9/11 families to move forward. I hope all of us can agree, or at least most of us, to modify that process to make sure we don't have the unintended consequences that everybody in the national security infrastructure of the United States is telling us we've created. No member of the Senate, in wanting to help the 9/11 families, I believe, want to expose other families and those who serve this nation to being hauled into foreign courts and being accused of crime and being sued, and we have a chance to fix it. But I'll tell you this, if we don't fix it, we're going to regret it, because the activities we're engaged in today, I'm afraid, could be a basis of action against our nation under the law that we passed here. If you did exactly what this law allows in another country, and the terrorist organization was helped by the United States, even if you view them as terrorists, even though we didn't know about what they did, we could actually be liable, and I don't want that. So,
could I ask my colleague just one additional question? We've heard from literally every Middle Eastern country on this issue, and no threats have been made. The conversation between us and ministers of various countries in the Middle East have been of grave concern, of support for the fundamentals of this law, but also a deep concern about the ramifications that my colleague from South Carolina just described. So let's for a moment put yourself in their position. You face now the possibility of a lawsuit brought against your country because some acts of terror have taken place by citizens of your country without your knowledge or assistance. So you're about to go into court in the United States of America, and you have significant assets that, and you're the lawyer and I'm not, but it seems to me the first thing a good lawyer is going to want to do is freeze the assets so that pending the outcome of the suit that is being brought. So wouldn't it make sense? And by the way, I have received no threats in our conversations with these countries. But wouldn't anybody in their right mind say, hey, I'm not going to risk having my assets frozen there and maybe spend years in litigation in the courts?
Yes, I think the foreign policy of nations and the willingness to assist us as a nation is very much up in the air if we don't somehow modify this law. Because if you're doing business in the United States, and let's just pick Saudi Arabia, the claims can be brought against the Saudi government. If there's a judgment, those assets can be attached and they can be taken. If you're not doing business here, you don't have to worry about your assets being taken by a court. I want to stress this, that there can be a claim, but that claim has to be able to prove that the nation state, example Saudi Arabia, knew or should have known of the attack itself and aided the attack. Now, if you can prove that, then we not only should allow lawsuits, we should really rethink our relationship with Saudi Arabia. And here's what the Saudis tell me. If we actually did that, I don't blame you for rethinking the relationship with us. So the bottom line is, what you say is very true, Senator McCain. If this law stands in the United States, and this is an emotional time in the world, juries are, they render justice, but Mideastern nations are not very popular right now for sometimes good reason. The Saudis are helping people in Yemen. They're helping people in Syria. Sometimes they're helping people differently than we're helping because they're more worried about Iran than Assad. It is a complex world, and I think nation states are going to be reluctant to do business in America if they come from a complex part of the world if we don't modify this law, because all of their assets are subject not only to being confiscated through a court process, it would no longer be a safe place to do business. And I would stress this, the same thing could happen to us in other countries. If some groups that we're helping in Syria somehow want to take on Saudi Arabia because they don't like their government, I don't want us to be sued in Saudi court and the American business assets that lie in Saudi Arabia be seized or attached if we didn't know that the people in question were actually going to attack Saudi Arabia and collaborated in that attack.
Let me ask you another scenario. Drone strikes. We commit drone strikes literally everywhere in the Middle East where we find there are terrorists who are capable of mounting attacks on the United States of America. They're precision strikes. But on many occasions, civilians, as collateral damage, have also been killed. I mean, those are facts. Those are just facts. So what exposure are we subject to now?
That's a really good question, because the purpose of this legislation is to hold nation states responsible for aiding terrorist organizations. Now, the YPG Kurds in the eyes of the Turkey could be a terrorist group. Certainly Al-Qaeda in the eyes of everybody is a terrorist group. But we are now chasing terrorists all over the world. We're receiving information from one organization, taking that information and militarizing it, using it in a lethal fashion, hitting people we don't intend to hit. Here's what would solve this problem. For liability to exist on any nation state, including the United States, the only time you can be sued is if you intended and knowingly engaged in the activity, partnering with a terrorist group, or separately with the knowledge that you meant for this to happen. And if we don't have that knowing requirement, we're going to open ourselves up to a lot of heartache throughout the world.
And isn't it logical? Isn't it logical to say that you shouldn't hold a government of a country liable if something happened by attack from their country or by one of their citizens that we didn't know about? I mean, this is why I'm confused as to why that just doesn't have a logical aspect to it, that we don't want to hold people who are not guilty liable for damages.
This is a really good question. One of the defenses, or one of the concepts we want to introduce into the new modification, is discretionary decisions by nation states. The original bill said you couldn't sue based on a discretionary decision, a planning activity, a strategic decision. Apparently, there's some evidence that lower-level Saudi officials or people in Saudi Arabia provided some money, helped people get passports, helped people do this, helped people do that. We don't want to be held liable if we have a rogue employee in a consulate somewhere. It has to be that the nation state at the highest level of government to be liable for the torturous act knew or should have known. And if we don't want to be guilty by association, you don't want to be held liable as an entire nation state because you have one part of the government doing a function that was not approved by the government as a whole. All I can say is we're making strategic decisions today. I don't know how much money we've given to the Kurds and other allies in Syria fighting ISIL, but I can tell you some of these groups, in the eyes of other people in the region, are terrorists. And they have an agenda outside of fighting ISIL. I don't want to be liable because we help them in the cause of fighting ISIL if they go do something else to harm somebody else, some other nation, unless we knew about it, because it will stop our ability to have partners. And unfortunately, in the war on terror, you're not going to win the war if you don't make alliances. And sometimes these alliances are with pretty unsavory people. Saudi Arabia is in the same boat we're in. And if you open up the floodgates in the United States to being able to be liable because the activity occurred, people from your country were involved, but you don't have the requirement of saying that you knew about it and you wanted it to happen, then we're opening ourselves up to a liability all over the globe, because unlike Saudi Arabia, we're all over the place. We're everywhere in the Philippines. I can't think of a region in the world that are not American operatives, intelligence officials, or military officials that are not somehow joined in the fight against different forms of terrorism. And all I'm asking is that we modify this law. You can bring a claim against anybody you think caused 9/11, including a country like Saudi Arabia, but you got to prove that the government knew about it, should have known about it, and aided in the actual act. And that's not in the law. And if we don't put that in the law, it's going to bite us all. And everybody who's in charge of fighting this war is trying to tell us we've gone too far. So next year, Senator McCain, Senator Graham, and hopefully others will make it a top priority to modify this law so that we can conduct foreign policy as a nation and not put our war fighters at risk and those we rely upon to win this war, because we're not helping the 9/11 families by putting people at risk for no good reason who are out there all over the world trying to protect us. And that's exactly what we've done if we don't modify this law.
And could I also emphasize, this is not the opinion of the senator from South Carolina and myself. This is the opinion of the President of the United States. This is the opinion of the Secretary of Defense. This is the opinion of the Secretary of State. This is the opinion of the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. This is the opinion of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I've had a lot of support in my time for various issues. I cannot remember a time in the last 30 years where literally every leader in government has come out in the strongest possible fashion, not to do away with JASTA, but to fix it so that the United States of America itself is not put in jeopardy as other nations adopt this same law. So, Mr. President, I reiterate my request that the letter from the President of the United States, the Secretary of State of the United States, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director of the Central Intelligence Agencies be included in the record.
Without objection.
I urge my colleagues to pay attention to the most respected individuals in this country and pay attention to why they object, not to the entire bill, but the provisions that would, as Director Brennan said, would cause the most damaging consequences would be for those U.S. government officials who dutifully work overseas on behalf of our country. The principle of sovereign immunity, and I'm quoting from the Director of the CIA, the principle of sovereign immunity protects U.S. officials every day and is rooted in reciprocity. If we fail to uphold this standard for other countries, we place our own nation's officials in danger. No country has more to lose from undermining that principle than the United States, and Mr. Brennan adds, and few institutions would be at greater risk than the CIA. I urge my colleagues not to abolish JASTA, but let's fix it. Let's fix it. Because the people we respect and admire the most and give the responsibilities to defend this nation have unanimously argued that we need this fix. And I fear, I say to the President, I fear the profound consequences that may arise if we, with the best of intentions, do great damage to this nation and its security. Mr. President, I yield the floor.